Hi, everybody. There was a little bit of a mix-up. We had two event links, so now we're all back together in one group. Cool. I think we're good to give it a go. Let me share my screen with you. Perfect. So, welcome everybody. My name is Kimo. I'm from the Expat Housing Network. We are all internationals, so we know what it's like to move to a new country. And we were founded 5 years ago, or I founded the company 5 years ago, and we decided to help people find a home and feel at home. We help people with finding a home to rent, but also with finding a home to buy. Especially nowadays with the rental prices being quite high, we decided that, or I think it's smart to actually find a place to purchase. There will probably be many questions that you have during this webinar. What I would suggest is that you answer the questions or you ask the questions in the chat. At the end of the webinar, I'll answer all of them. And then if you have any further questions, then feel free to answer, but I'd like to go through the presentation first, and then in the end, we can answer all the questions that are there. What I'm going to talk about today is the steps of buying a home, but also we'll touch base on who you're going to meet during the process of buying a home. Of course, it starts with mortgage advice, finding out what you can actually borrow, and it ends with getting the keys and becoming a proud owner of the property. Mortgage advice is first. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to add them in the chat, and I'll get back to the questions at the end of the presentation, try to answer any of them. So, mortgage advice. It's super important to understand before you actually start searching what you can loan from the bank or borrow from the bank, because that will give you the range in what you can search for. On average, it's about 5 times your gross yearly salary. When it comes to bonuses or 30% ruling, they play a little bit into it, not much. What we would advise is for you to either talk with a mortgage broker or with your bank to check, okay, what different mortgages are out there. We kind of like always, or I kind of always kind of like to compare a mortgage broker and a bank in the way that you compare, for example, a shoe shop versus an online shoe retailer. The shoe shop has a certain amount of products, a certain amount of shoes, like the bank does, and they'll try to sell you the ones that they have in stock that are there. The online brand has a range, a very large or a much larger range of stock and products to offer, which is kind of like the mortgage broker. What I would advise you is get in there and just get a free chat with each, with the bank you're at, but also with a mortgage broker to find out a little bit more about the mortgage that fits you best. So a couple of things that are worth looking into. Interest rates, of course, one of the most important. They're relatively low at the moment compared to 5 to 10 years ago. Who knows what's going to happen in the future? That's a good question. It seems like money is still cheap to lend also for banks, thanks to the Central European banks. And that means that, yeah, the interest rate will likely be low because we want to actually motivate people buying properties and investing in the economy. The second thing besides the interest rates is the bracket. So the easiest way to compare that or to explain that is that if you buy a property of 100,000 euros, the mortgage that you get is 100,000 euros. If that property goes up in price, then suddenly the risk reward ratio for the bank is different, right? Like, so the bank runs less risk because let's say you were to sell that property or you were forced to sell the property, the bank would easily get that money back. The more that difference becomes, the less risk for the bank and the more willing they are to lower the interest rates. Some banks say, okay, if you've paid off 10% or if there's a difference between the value and the mortgage of about 10%, then you'll get a discount on your interest rate. Some say it's 15, some say it's 20, some have brackets every 10%. And so it's good to look into that, because the more you'll pay off, the lower your mortgage becomes. Then the last thing is the payoff penalty. How much do you have to pay if you want to pay off your mortgage in full, or you want to pay off a little bit more? Different banks or different mortgage providers have different criteria when it comes to that. By the way, for the new people who join, if you have any questions, please feel free to add it in the Q&A, and then I'll address them at the end of the presentation. So you know where you can borrow from the bank. Now you're good to go. Of course, try to figure out where you look for a property. The first thing, of course, is online. Funda is the biggest resource here in the Netherlands. About 95% of the properties on the market are on Funda. The properties that are not on the market are most of the time very expensive properties, above $1 million, stuff like that. Sometimes you'll hear from properties that are sold before they come on the market. The majority of those properties are properties that are from project developers who circumvent, kind of like go around some of the real estate platforms and just go directly to some real estate agents. That is not a lot though. So anybody telling you like, hey, go with this agent or go with that agent because they have all the access to the properties that are off the market, yeah, that's not true. So once you've started your search on the platforms, then of course figure out which neighborhood you want to move to. The different neighborhoods, of course, ask for different pricing. The closer you get to the center, the more expensive you get. If you go outside of the ring road, then it's less expensive. Also, of course, the neighborhoods that are very green or across from a park or stuff like that might be a little more expensive than if you go 4 or 5 blocks down. An agent or not. So I always like to say it's not rocket science finding and buying a home, but there are a few things that you want to take into account. Some of the documentation will be in Dutch. Some of the legal contracts, some of the documentation linked to the property you want to purchase are in Dutch. And the Dutch rules and regulations also apply. So understanding them is something that you can do if you have the time and the amount of brains in your head to actually do that. Sometimes it's easier to actually get an agent in. They'll be able to help you with the process. We'll share a little bit later what an agent actually does for you. But of course, you can already start with the search yourself, go on Fund and just have a look around and see if there's anything that matches your budget and that actually matches your expectations as well. So once you've started the search, you found a few properties that you like. Super important is to double check what the conditions of those properties are. Because nobody wants to buy a place and then 2 months after they've moved in, want to find out that they have to repair the roof and it's going to cost them a couple of €1,000. So the condition is the most important thing to double check when you view a property. Finding out more about the landlord, the owner association, and the neighbors is also good. Why do you want to find out more about the landlord? Because it's going to help you set up a winning bid a little bit later, right? You want to actually take into account what is important for the landlord when they sell the house. The owner association, this applies mainly for apartments because they are part of an apartment block and all the owners in that block have a responsibility together to maintain the building, the public areas and stuff like that. That is what an owner association does. If you buy a freestanding house or just a house with a garden at front and back, then most of the time you won't have an owner association. Sometimes it does happen that multiple owners in a row of properties are combined in an owner association. If that is the case, or if you're looking to buy an apartment, then look into the minutes of those associations because every year they have to have a meeting. They also have to have a budget and they have to have savings. So look into those things because you want to make sure that if you buy an apartment in a block, that the building is maintained properly. Because if it's not, and suddenly something happens, then it's going to devalue your property as well. Neighbors, same thing. Extreme example, you don't want to have somebody with a bowling alley living on top of your house. So make sure you know a little bit more about who you're moving in or what kind of building you're moving into, who the neighbors are, if there's any disputes or discussions going on at the moment with the neighbors. Sometimes, for example, if the fence is built just like 50 centimeters outside of your plot, in the plot of the neighbor, then you want to make sure that that's not a thing that you actually inherit when you buy the property. Then you also want to find out more about the actual property that you viewed, right? What you can do is you can request property documents from the seller or the selling agent. Those documents will give you a little bit more information about the property. They will have the owner association meetings and minutes and budget in there. They'll have the deed of transfer, which proves that the seller are actually the owners of the property and are allowed to sell it. They'll have a questionnaire sometimes in them. Sometimes selling agents are very minimalistic and they only share one document with you, but you can actually ask for more and see what they have. Again, these documents are mostly in Dutch, so it's good to have somebody to double check them to see what they say. Cool. Okay, so you viewed the property. Now you're submitting an offer. What is a winning offer? That is the question that we get a lot of the times. Well, first of all, of course, purchase price is important, right? In the end, people can say whatever they want, but the amount that they're going to get for the property is important. What is good to know, though, is that since the banks only give you 100% of the value of the property, the amount that you'll bid in the end is key to whether the selling party will take you seriously or not. Let me give you an example. Okay, again, let's make it easy. The property is on the market for 100,000 euros. The value, which will be determined after you purchase the property, is also 100,000 euros. The bank will only give you 100,000 euros. If you say, okay, hey, I'm going to offer 125,000 euros, then the 25,000 euros will have to come out of your own pocket because the bank is not going to give you that money. Okay, if you put that price in your offer and you don't share information about the fact that you maybe have some funds and you can easily actually back that up, then the selling party will be like, this is not a serious offer because we're afraid that this person doesn't have the money to actually make up for the difference. So the highest offer doesn't always win. The offer with the best conditions in combination with the purchase price will probably win. And the conditions are, for example, the dissolving clauses. A dissolving clause is a clause that gives you the right to pull out of a deal if it's not met. The most important for a dissolving clause is the financial clause. What do we mean by that? Well, the financial clause is a clause that allows you to pull out of the deal if you're not able to secure a mortgage. Let's say the bank doesn't want to give you a mortgage, or suddenly something happens with your job, or name it, and then if you don't get a mortgage, you don't want to be able to, or you don't want to be committed to a deal that you can't move forward with. So this dissolving clause gives you that right. If you do not put this in, then, and the bank doesn't give you the money, then you are committed to move forward. And if you don't, then the selling party can actually charge you a 10% fine, 10% being 10% of the purchase price. So this is important to put in. What is interesting is in combination with what I just said, so let's say the property is 100,000, you put in 125, but you clearly state that you do not need a mortgage to do this, or you don't have the finance clause in it. Then the selling party might be like, okay, that's interesting, because once they're committed, they're going to move forward no matter whether they're going to get the mortgage or not. So you can also play around with that a little bit. If you're confident that you're going to get a mortgage, and your mortgage advisor, your bank says, yes, we are 99% positive that you're going to get a mortgage, be mindful though, there's never a full guarantee. Then you can play around with this to make your offer a little bit more attractive. The tech inspection is also something that's important. Like if you have doubts about the house and you're like, okay, hey, I'm not sure what the condition of this thing is, you might want to have a technical inspection clause in there, stating that if you're not happy with the report of the technical inspector, then you can pull out. Sometimes selling parties say, okay, the amount that you'll have to put into the house should be above 5,000 euros. Otherwise, you'll have to move forward anyways. This is something you can negotiate on because we would always advise you, especially with properties that are a little bit older, to have somebody come in and double check the actual property. And that somebody is not us, that somebody's not a good friend, that somebody's probably somebody who has a background in construction, and technical inspectors have that, so they know what to look out for. Okay, so we've talked about the purchase price, we've talked about the dissolving clauses. One other thing is the timeline and the deadline. So there's two things there. The timeline is, when would you like to receive the keys? How long do you need to actually get the mortgage done? Those things are things you actually want to put in that offer as well. The deadline is something else, because you don't want your offer to be used as a benchmark. So let's say you submit an offer today. If you don't put a deadline in, so the offer doesn't expire, the selling party could use your offer and talk to other people who are submitting offers tomorrow, the day after, and say, hey, we've got this on the table. If you offer a little bit more, then you can get this. So you don't want that. So what you want to do is you want to say, okay, hey, let's submit an offer and give them a 24 or 48 hour deadline. before they have to actually respond. So that is something that you can use, play around with that a little bit. Again, one of the reasons why I said get as much information about the landlord as possible is because you don't want to give them a 24-hour deadline if, for example, they're going through a divorce, right? Sometimes it takes a little bit more time to actually get two noses in the same direction. The same thing applies if it's inherited, and so on, so on. Congratulations, you've got the property. Well done, well done, well done, well done, well done, well done. What now? Okay, so when the offer is accepted, the deal is not done yet. So you still have room to pull out of the deal. The selling party still has room to pull out of the deal. It's only set in stone once that contract is signed. But before you commit to something, you want to make sure there's a couple of things that you've done. First one is the inspection, right? Do a technical inspection, especially with older properties. If it's a new build, there's not a lot to inspect. If it's an older property, there's plenty to inspect. So have somebody come in and double check the property to make sure that you understand in what condition it is. Because if you want to negotiate on anything, then you want to make sure that you understand what needs to be done and how much you want to negotiate on. Foundation inspection, same thing applies. If there's cracks in the walls, then you might want to double check the foundations. An appraiser is also important. So I just mentioned that the banks only give you 100% of the value of the property. This is where the appraiser comes in. They actually look at the property and say, hey, this is what the property is worth. It's a little bit more complex than that. They'll do research. They'll look at properties sold in the past. They'll look at the condition of the property. They'll look at what's in savings, stuff like that. And altogether, they will create a valuation report. Then the banks will actually look at that, and that will be the amount that you'll be able to get. Of course, there's ways to get a little bit more. If, for example, you want to make it more energy efficient, or if you want to do renovation, that's going to increase the value. Those are ways to actually get a little bit more. If I look distracted sometimes, it's because somebody says something in the chat and then kind of like a light starts blinking. So I'm like, oop, okay. But and just so you know, just continue. If you have any questions, put them in the chat. I'll go to the questions once I'm done with the presentation. So hang in there a little bit. The contractor, if you want to do any renovations to the property, have somebody come in that knows what it means to do renovations or to build that extension, stuff like that, because that is super important for you to know. It might impact the amount that you want to offer, or it might impact the amount that you want to actually request from the bank as an addition to your mortgage. Have these guys come in between the moment that your offer is accepted and that you sign the purchase contract. Okay, the purchase contract. Who makes the contract? Well, if you buy in Eindhoven, the selling party makes the purchase contract. If you buy in Amsterdam, the notary makes the purchase contract. What is in the purchase contract? And by the way, that distinction is kind of like Amsterdam is notaries, outside of Amsterdam, it's selling agents. So that makes it a little bit easier. What is in the purchase contract? In the purchase contract, the agreement between you and the seller are laid out. The most important thing, of course, is what you're going to buy the property for, what the dissolving clauses are, what the conditions are, and when you're going to move in. There's also a lot of rights and responsibilities, mainly being the seller stating that the property is free of any third-party claims, and you stating that you've actually inspected the property or had the option to inspect the property. Once you sign that purchase contract and the seller signs as well, the seller can no longer back out. He's locked in. You, however, have 3 days to reconsider, to pull out, to have doubts and anything. Please be mindful, those days cannot end on a weekend or on a public holiday. Once those that cool-off period expires, you're locked into the deal. Okay, so now there's like a time where you've signed the purchase contract and you get the keys. In that meantime, the mortgage broker will try to secure your mortgage, or the bank will request your approval or approve your request, sorry. But besides that, it's a little bit of a quiet period. You might want to use this to go into the property again or request access to the property again and review the condition, or maybe take some measures, maybe discuss what you want to take over from the selling party. But besides that, not much happens in this time. And then the day arrives where you get the keys to the property. Before you get the keys to the property though, you do a final inspection because you want to make sure that the property is in the same condition as when you last saw it. When people move out, they move stuff, right? When stuff gets moved, things maybe appear. When stuff gets moved, things maybe get damaged. So you want to make sure that you don't find a big gaping hole in that wall where the piano stood when you last viewed it, right? If it does happen that something appears or something shows up that's unexpected, then you go to the notary. Either way, you'll go to the notary, but you can tell the notary to hold some money in his escrow, so in deposit, that will only be transferred to the seller once it's fixed. There are some costs involved with this though, but there's kind of like a safety net for you guys there. Okay, so what I mentioned, you do the final inspection, then you go to the notary, and at the notary, you'll sign two big documents. One is the transfer deed, the other one is the mortgage deed. The transfer deed is called the transfer deed because you'll transfer, or the title of the property, or the title of ownership of the property is moved from the selling party to you. This all stems back to Napoleon, who at some point said, guys, if we want to collect taxes accurately, we need to find a way to document what everybody owns. So what they set up is the land registry. The land registry is kind of like a big database owned by the government that shows who owns what, whether it's land, whether it's property, stuff like that. And the title of ownership is documented in that land registry. They'll be transferred to you, so that's what the transfer deed is. The transfer deed will also say that all the dissolving clauses have expired, and that the purchase contract is an integral part of the transfer deed. The mortgage deed is the second big document that you'll sign at the notary. What is good to know is that the mortgage deed is the agreement between you and the bank. The bank will have the sole right to actually sell the house from under you if you don't meet the terms of the mortgage. Then the bank also has the right to increase the amount of the mortgage if they incur any costs by chasing you for your mortgage. Besides that, it's all good. It's probably going to be one of the biggest loans that you'll ever get, but with the current interest rates, it's quite interesting. Then once you've signed those documents, you'll get the keys to the property. Congratulations, well done. What is good to know though is that before this day arrives, you have to transfer all the remaining money. So the bank will transfer the 100%, and then any extra costs that are incurred for purchasing the property, you'll have to pay out of pocket. That has to be in the account of the notary the day before. Cool. So you've signed, you owned your ownership of the, or you're the owner of the property. Now, let's say a week in, you want to bake a cake, right, or a pie, and then you find out the oven doesn't work. What happens now? Well, technically you have a certain period of time to hold the landlord liable for things, because the landlord should disclose everything they know about the property to you. Let me give you an example. We had a case where a power socket wasn't working in one of the properties. Well, what you don't do during an inspection or during the transfer, the final inspection, you don't inspect all the power sockets, right? But we found out about this one after we signed everything, they moved in. And then it turns out that in order to fix that, they had to rewire part of the circuit and have to open up the wall, and it would cost about 1,500 euros to 2,000 euros. That was quite a big post. So what we said, hey, this power socket wasn't working before we moved in, and the selling party should have known. They've lived there for 5 years, right? So they should have disclosed this with us. They didn't. We held them liable. We were able to actually get the money for the fixes from them. So that is something. The longer it takes, though, before you mention something, the more difficult it becomes to prove that you don't, or that it was already the case when you moved in, right? So therefore, there's like an average of 2 months. And don't wait until the end of the 2 months to actually share what's wrong with the property. Make sure that you do that before. So as soon as you find out about something, discuss it. Yep. Cool. Okay, so what's the buying timeline? This can take months to years. It depends a little bit on what's on the market, what you're looking for. Let me see if you can see my cursor. So you start the search. This is a little bit skewed. This can take a while. It can also be relatively quickly. It depends on what you're looking for and what is out there, of course. Always supply and demand. And once you submit an offer and it's approved, then you have like a week to arrange for the technical inspector, the appraiser, and then another week for the notary to draft up all the documents and get the purchase contract ready. If it's a selling party that drafts the purchase contract, it might take a little bit less time. It might happen a little bit faster instead of a week, maybe a few days. Either way, you want to double check it. So take your time for that. Once you've signed the purchase contract, you can actually start with your mortgage application. Of course, before that, you can do a lot of pre-work, deliver documents that they're requesting, stuff like that. But the official application will happen once you've signed all the documents. Okay, then there's a 3-day cool-off period, and it takes up to 4 weeks to get your mortgage approved. Sometimes, it's very rarely, it takes a little bit longer. Most of the times it happens faster, but take an average of 4 weeks, then you're safe. Between the mortgage deed being approved, or the mortgage being approved, and the moment that you actually sign and get the keys, there's this one moment where you get a final statement or the final note or the final invoice from the notary stating that the bank has paid this much. This is the outstanding amount that you'll have to pay. Please transfer this within a period of time. And then the day arrives that you're going to get the keys. You sign the last few deeds, the deed of mortgage, the deed of transfer, and then you have that 2 months of liability. So the most optimistic view is, let's say you buy or you submit an offer tomorrow, it gets accepted, then take 2 weeks before you sign the purchase contract, then another 4 weeks, and then, of course, depending on when the delivery is, let's say the delivery is relatively quickly, so 3 to 4 weeks after your mortgage gets approved, then you have the handover date. But that moment from buying or getting your offer accepted to getting the keys could be anywhere between 2.5 to 3 months, or much longer, depending on when the seller wants to move out. But 2.5 months is kind of like the most optimistic that or the most quick or the fastest that we've seen it so far. This, of course, is when you have to get a mortgage. If you pay in cash, it can all be done much quicker, right? But I think the majority of you will actually request a mortgage. And even if you have a lot of cash, I would still consider getting a mortgage due to the low interest rates. Okay. Then, what I mentioned earlier is that the notary will share with you an invoice between the moment your mortgage gets approved and the moment you have to, or you get the keys. And in that invoice, it will show buyer's costs. These are the costs that you have to take into account and when you actually purchase your property. Let's start off with the top one, the stamp duty or transfer tax. That's 2% of the purchase price. That's also already the biggest one. And this applies to properties that you buy from owners. If you buy a new build, it's a product development, then you don't pay this 2%. Then you have the bank or the mortgage broker, anywhere between 1,500 and 3,400 euros. Please note that the bank also charges you money for getting a mortgage. It's interesting, you have to pay them to get a product from them. It's interesting. What is good to know though is that some of these amounts are tax deductible. So what that means is you can actually deduct this amount from the taxable income that you pay at the end of the year, which means that you'll get some money back at the end of the year of you buying a property. Notary costs, they're for the transfer and the mortgage deed, anywhere between 1,750 and 2,500. Only the mortgage deed is deductible from your taxable amount at the end of the year. The real estate agent, anywhere between 1 to 2%. I still find that fascinating because the majority and request this, and I don't understand why you should pay more if you're already paying more for the property. So this is a little bit old-fashioned, but hey, they are. Then you have a translator. Of course, it depends on what language you want to translate from. Maybe if it's a very rare language, you'll pay a little bit more versus just English. Then you have the appraiser. The appraiser charges anywhere between 500 to 600 euros, also depending a little bit on the property. The technical inspector charge 450 euros, and the bank guarantee. This is interesting to know. The bank guarantee is something that you'll be requested. The seller will want to have a deposit from you, a 10% deposit after everything is kind of like settled. So once you get your mortgage approved, they'll say, okay, hey, we would like to get a 10% deposit. You can pay that in 2 ways. Either you pay it in cash, if you have it, or you can get a bank guarantee. Bank guarantee is the guarantee from the bank. The bank will say, okay, hey, I will guarantee that this money will be in the account if something were to happen. And for that, I charge 1% of the amount that I'm guaranteeing. Easy enough calculation. You buy a property for 400,000 euros. The deposit that they'll request is 10%, meaning 40,000 euros, which will mean that the bank guarantee will cost you 1% of that 40,000 euros, which is 400 bucks. Some banks or mortgage providers actually offer this for free. So have a look into that as well. Okay, who will you meet? We can go over this a little bit quicker because I touched base on the majority of the steps before. Hence, Hans, the notary, Hans creates legal binding agreements. If you live in Amsterdam, he'll arrange the purchase contract. If you live outside of Amsterdam, the selling party will arrange the purchase contract. But he'll definitely arrange the mortgage deed and deed of transfer. Hans will come into play, of course, depending on where you live, after your offer is accepted, right? Good to know. He's an independent party, so he doesn't work for either. He works for both technically because he also has to do some things for the selling party. If they have a mortgage that needs to be closed, he also has to do some work for them. Then you have Michelle, the appraiser. The bank will ask Michelle for a report. As per mentioned, she'll come in and she'll do a viewing of the property and she'll review properties that have been sold. And then she comes up with a report. That report has to be approved by an independent institute like the NWWI. And what they do is they look at if the report meets the criteria that are officially stated. If not, then they'll ask some follow-up questions, but they want to make sure that appraisers don't just get valuations out of thin air. Getting the report, so anywhere between 3 to 7 days. Then you have Millie, the building inspector. She will come on based on your request. She's not mandatory like the appraiser is. And what she'll do is she'll do a visual inspection. She might bring some tools to double check if there's humidity behind the walls or if there's a floor that's not level, but she'll do mainly a visual inspection. They have a good understanding of construction, so they'll actually be able to tell you what needs to be repaired on short notice or in due time. The majority of the technical inspection reports will give you a range of things that need to be fixed within a year, between 1 and 5 years, and after 5 years. Yeah, that gives you a little bit of an idea. The majority of the things that need to be fixed within a year, you could consider some of them actually to negotiate again with the selling party. Robin, your mortgage advisor, or from your bank, he will share a little bit more information about the different mortgages, especially when it's a broker. They'll do that. They have a range between 20 to 40 different mortgages. They'll help you prepare the right documents and submit the mortgage application on your behalf. And they'll actually chase the bank. Then you have buying consultants who will actually support you with buying a property. They will search on your behalf. They will view properties with you, for you, do research. And I think that when it comes to buying consultants, this is the added value that they have majority of the time is they do research, right? They do property research. And they do price research. Property research is, okay, hey, what are the documents linked to the property? Is it in a good condition? Stuff like that. They also do price research. So they'll be able to give you an idea of what the actual value of that property is, because that's really going to make a difference. The majority of you will probably see prices on Funda and say, okay, hey, what do I do with this, right? A lot of people say, how much do I have to overbid? Because currently it's still quite a competitive market, and they say, how much do I have to bid over the asking price to actually get it? What we always say is that, okay, the asking price doesn't say anything about the actual value, right? The actual value might be a little bit higher, a little bit lower. The asking price says a little bit more about the optimism of the selling party. Maybe they've heard that people are going crazy, so they'll put it up for a little bit more and just see where it ends. Maybe they're careful, they want to sell it as soon as possible, so they'll put it below the actual value. So that's something they'll look into. Also reviewing all the Dutch and legal documents and setting up all the meetings with the notary, the inspector, the appraiser, and stuff like that. Okay, that was it. Those were the people that you're actually going to meet during the buying process. I've touched base on the process itself. I see there are some questions in there. Sorry, slow down. So I think this whole session is being recorded, so I can actually share it with you so you can re-listen to it. Okay, I'm going to go over the questions. If you have any extra questions, please pop them in the chat and I'm happy to answer them. Okay, so Sasank asks, how or does final purchase price usually involve bidding for new construction? I don't completely understand your question. Does the final purchase price usually involve bidding for new construction? Let me think what I think what it means is that when you buy a new property, do you have to bid for that property? Yes, most of the times you do. They still want to get as much as possible out of that property. Sometimes it's registration, which means that you have to submit your offer and they'll pick the best one. It's not like if it's a new build, you see the purchase price and they're like, if you offer it, you'll get it. No, the majority of the time you still have to bid. As per you is older property, 10 years, 20 years or more by Hale Munchu. What is an older property? Yeah, that's a good question. I think a 10-year-old property is relatively new. I would say anything older than 20 or 30 years is something you want to look into a little bit more, because that's when things start to decay a little bit, whether it's the roof or whether it's the boiler or stuff like that. You want to double check. Also, in terms of building standards, that differs. Like anything built in the 80s or the 70s is from a different standard than things that were built 10 years ago. Please slow down so I can take a few notes. Sorry, Marina, I will try to remember that next time, but you can actually receive the recording a little bit later. Can you get a mortgage of a foreign bank? So that depends on the foreign bank. I think it really depends. In the end, you have to prove here where you got the money from. I am not aware of foreign banks actually being able to secure or offer mortgages for properties outside of their current home. I wonder, especially nowadays, if that is still popular. There's probably going to be banks that offer it, but double check the interest rates, yeah? Because the criteria might be a little bit different. Is the cool-off period the sold on the reservation label on Fonda? No, not necessarily. So let's say you have a dissolving clause that states that you want to get a mortgage before you can actually move forward, right? Then that period between your offer being accepted and the moment where your mortgage is approved, that is where it's still relatively uncertain for the seller if you can actually move forward. Most of the times, nothing happens. But what they do is sold on a reservation. It means that it's sold, but it could still be that if your mortgage provider doesn't come through, then the sale is canceled and then it will be sold again. So it's not necessarily linked to the cool-off period of 3 days. It's linked to something else. Does land ownership when buying a house increase the purchase costs? How common is it that while buying a house, you don't own the land? This is compared to land lease. It depends a little bit where you buy. The majority of the municipalities don't have ground lease. There's some municipalities where it's relatively popular. Amsterdam is one of them. When you buy a property, just figure out if you own the land or not. It should be in the listing. The selling agent and the buying agent that are supporting you, well, the buying agent is supporting you, the selling agent is supporting the landlord. They should mention it to you. And what does it do to the purchase price? If you buy a property where you don't own the land, the purchase price should be technically a little bit lower. If you do own the land, it should be a little bit higher. Again, what we've seen in the past is that when you don't own the land and the ground lease, because you'll pay the municipality for leasing the ground, is relatively low, then that of course reflects in the amount that you'll pay for the property. If the ground lease is a little bit higher, the same thing happens. Sometimes it's the case, the ground lease has been paid off for a period, so for 50 years. Then that also impacts the value, right? And what we've seen is that if it's paid off for a longer period of time, people don't even look at it anymore, because how long are you going to stay in a property? It's very unlikely that you'll stay there for the full 50 years. The impact on the value will happen the closer you get to the end of that 50 years. So have a look at that. Okay, hi Kimo, would you be sharing the slide deck along with the recording? Yes, Hillary, I will. Dinesh, is it better to buy a house with NHG range or non-NHG range? What will be the difference in interest, 10 years fixed? For the majority of you, or for some of you who don't know what NHG is a guarantee scheme from the government stating that if you buy a property under a certain amount, I think the amount now is 315,000 euros, a little bit lower, then you get a guarantee. What that means is, let's say the market crashes and you lose your job and you have a property, but the value of the property is below what you bought it for, then what we call the property is underwater. Then the NHG will guarantee that that difference will not be what you lose in money. So that's good to know. It is interesting to buy that, but it's limited to the amount that you can actually offer or purchase the price property for. What will be the difference in interest? It depends per bank, of course. The interest rate, I think, at the moment is 1.59, something like that, 5.964, somewhere around that. It can be a little bit lower. It depends a little bit on what you're also getting as a mortgage. But have a look into that. I would say, and by the way, I have to correct myself, the value of the property is leading for getting the NHG. It's not the amount that you've actually purchased the property for. So let's say you buy a property for 350,000 euros, but the value is 300,000 euros, then you'll still be able to get the NHG. I hope that answers your question, Dinesh. Silvio, can we include repairs amount into the mortgage? If it adds value to the property, you can get it mortgaged partly by a bank, right? What you have to do for that is, okay, let me give you an example. You go into a property and you see that the bathroom is terrible, it's very old, it needs work. What you do is you get a contractor in to give you a quote on how much it's going to cost to actually repair and renovate that bathroom. Then you ask for the valuator, okay, hey, what is the value of the property now? And what will be the value if I actually fix up the bathroom? That difference in money, that is something that the bank will take into account. They'll not give you the full amount. They'll give you maybe 60 or 70% of that amount, but that's something that you can actually mortgage. If it doesn't add any value, the bank will not give you the money for it. When it comes to making it more energy efficient, then you can actually get a little bit more money for it. Like for example, solar panels, stuff like that. Does the bank accept that if it can directly increase the value of the property? Again, they'll review everything, so there's no guarantee that they'll accept it. You have to do your homework. Like I said, get a evaluator, get a contractor in, and make a case. This is, again, where I would get a mortgage broker in to actually support you, because they'll be able to make a case a little bit better. If we get a house under the market value, can we get a mortgage that matches market value and use it extra money for renovation? Thanks for the recording. Hi, Marina. That is a good question. So what I would advise is to check that with the bank. Again, I think the bank will look at the value of the property, but they'll also look at what you've purchased the property for, and they will want to know what you're actually going to do with that extra money. It's not like you can buy a car with the extra amount of money, right? So you still have to go through the same process, but yes, you can get that money and actually put it into renovations. Sank, for a new construction property, does it make sense to get a buying agent consultant? If yes, then why? It depends, like how much experience do you have? I would say yes, technically, because the process of buying a new build is a little bit different. The biggest difference being that from the moment you submit that offer to the moment you get the property, it works a little bit different because your property is not built yet. So in terms of mortgage and stuff like that, you'll pay for the ground that you own and the building that's slowly being constructed, but you also have a house that you rent. But the most important thing is that the building is not finished yet, and having influence on how they finish the building, the interior, and knowing what that is a big part of the work there. So that is something where a buying consultant can actually support you. Also with the negotiations, same thing apply, right? Getting a good feel for the value of the property, reviewing the documents, because there will be documents linked to that. So, and they'll be in Dutch. So I think that there's definitely a reason to request some help there. Again, it's not rocket science. If you're willing to take the risk and think there's nothing wrong with it, you can definitely do it yourself too. Hillary, apologies if you covered this already as I struggle to log in. Can you explain what the requirements are for a non-Dutch but EU national? Any benefits for first-time property owners in the Netherlands? I'm not sure what you mean by requirements. I think that you link it to your mortgage. It differs per mortgage broker. Some mortgage brokers state that, or mortgage providers, sorry. Some mortgage provider states that you have to live in the Netherlands for a certain amount of time. Others don't really care. Your employment contract is important. If you have a temporary contract, you need to be able to share or show an employer statement stating that if things go well, you'll keep your job. You don't always have to have a permanent contract. Any benefits for first-time property owners in the Netherlands? Well, it's great to live here, that's a benefit. No other benefits besides you have the interest deduction scheme, which means that you can deduct the interest from your taxable income at the end of the year. This only applies for if you buy a property that you actually live in. It doesn't apply if you buy an investment property. But once we get the house, let's say in the middle of the year, how does it work when it comes to paying taxes on the house and other costs like gas, water, electricity, etc.? Should we give proportional money back to previous owners? Yes, you will. What happens is at the day of you getting the keys, that day before you actually transfer the money that you owe still, and in it, the notary will have made a calculation. Let's say it's the 1st of June, right? Then up until that time, the owner or the seller was living in there. So they are responsible for that period for the municipality costs. But the majority of them have paid a year in advance. So they've paid in January or February. What you will do is you will say, okay, hey, I'm going to pay you back the money for the remainder of the year because I'm going to move into it now. And that's going to be settled at the municipality or at the notary. Other taxes worth taking into account: property tax, and again, municipality tax. Property tax is based on the value that the municipality gives to your property. It's always dated, that value, because they take properties that are sold in a neighborhood from a year ago or longer. So what you can do is double check if it's lower than what you expect the property to be worth. If it is, keep it like that. Don't contest it or anything like that. Property tax is, I think, 0.3%. So it's if you multiply your the value given to you by the municipality, then multiply it by 0.00, I think 036. So it's 0.36%. Cool. Dinesh, with the current Corona situation, is it better to wait before buying a house? Will the interest go down still? Poof, there's not a lot of room for it to go down. Of course, there's always room, right? But yeah, I think that it's difficult to look in the future, right? This is a crisis that is like no other. And I think they always say that, but it's very difficult to compare. Some compare it to the 30s in the US, some compare it to something else, but it's very difficult to compare because right now the governments and the banks are putting a lot of effort into making sure that there's no big backlash. There will be a backlash somewhere probably, but the housing shortage in NL is still relatively big. And it really depends on what's going to happen in the next year or 2 years, right? Do we find a vaccine? What's going on with the social distancing, travel, stuff like that? If we open up, if it becomes attractive to move to the Netherlands, and I think it is, right? I think that quality of living here is pretty good compared to some other countries or some other cities even. So that could mean that the flow of people moving here will just continue. People will flock towards the cities, I believe. Of course, if the cities become hot zones, then it might be the other way around. But technically, it's great to live in the city. So I think the majority still will want to live in the city, which means that the housing market is not going to collapse or go crazy. Of course, I don't have a glass ball. If I would have, I would share my insights with you, and then I would probably go to the beach. But for now, I think that if you want to buy, have a look at a few things. What is your current income? How much are you paying for rent? And what are the other costs incurred? If you can actually get something that costs you less and will end you up with a property because you're saving money, then do it, right? It's an easy calculation. If you have doubts, then feel free to reach out. Okay, does the Netherlands market offer mortgage insurance? I mean, tax benefits. I think I mentioned this earlier today, earlier during the session. Yes, it does. We offer the interest deduction scheme, which means that the interest you can actually deduct from your taxable income. Does the Netherlands market offer mortgage insurance? This is what we talked about a little bit earlier as well, the NHG, which means that if your property goes underwater, which means that it's worth less than what you've actually paid for the mortgage, then the difference will be covered by the NHG. But that is only up to a certain amount, up to 315,000 euros or 310,000 euros, I think. If you get a property that's worth more than that, then you won't be able to get that security. Is there a way to estimate quickly the property taxes of a property? You can do the calculation. we can share it with you. Just send us an email. What I'll do is I'll pop the email address in here, and I think we have a slide as well that shows the email address. And if you want to receive this presentation and recording, just send me an email. You can do it to buying@experthousingnetwork.nl. The same thing applies for the quick way to estimate the property taxes. We can share with you the calculations, and you can do that easily. Thank you very much. I think that was the last question. Any more questions? Did I miss anything? No. It was my pleasure. I still find it a little bit strange to talk to a screen, not get any feedback, but hopefully it was useful. We're happy to help you out, answer any questions. Just send us an email, buying@experthousingnetwork.nl. Another question from Sasank: why does NHG have a price threshold? Even if a property above 350 goes underwater, the buyer should have security, right? That is a good question. It has to do with finances. Let's say you buy a property for 700,000 euros. The risk for the government is just bigger, right? There's only so many people we can help. Plus, if you buy a property for 700,000 euros, then probably you have a decent income, which gives you the ability to save a little bit more. No, Hillary, when I say underwater, do I mean literally? No, but no, I don't. I mean that the value of the property is lower than the actual property or the actual mortgage that you have on it. Let's say that the market crashes and something happens where nobody's interested in buying a home anymore, but you still have a mortgage, and the price will decrease, or the value will decrease of the property, and you can't sell it for the amounts to actually cover your mortgage. I don't think the Netherlands is going to be underwater anytime soon. If you do think that, then we have lovely houseboats in this country, so don't hesitate to buy one of those. Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening and a long weekend ahead of you. Reach out to us via buying@experthousingnetwork.nl. If you want to have us support, we have two lovely colleagues in Eindhoven, Yashim and Giovanna. In Amsterdam, we also have some great colleagues to help you out. We're here to support you and share information. Again, if you have any questions, you know where to find us. Have a lovely evening. Take care.